Morning, Father Silly. Morning. And good evening there in US.
Good evening. Looks like we got somebody else from the Philippines.
Yes, I told them about our schedule.
Okay, great.
Hi, Father. Good evening there.
There's Mr. Ayer.
Greetings.
We're going to have a bigger crowd this evening.
Okay, good.
Before we get started, we got a couple minutes to go, but anybody have any questions or anything that was unanswered or untaken care of from last time? I went to, so this whole question of archiving the videos is become a pain, and so I've taken a little bit in my own hands. I have the Scott School has a YouTube channel, scott.school.of theology
Ah,
at Gmail.
ah,
If you go
ah,
to the
ah.
Scott School, I've uploaded all the um the three class we've had so far to that YouTube channel.
Okay, that was the missing piece.
I will actually send that out.
Okay.
Um, Let me go over to, hang on a second here. I can actually I can actually go to the channel, copy this here. Um,
You just want the link to the channel? I threw that up in the chat.
I'm sending an email out right now with the link if you haven't already found it.
Yeah, I just put it up in the chat if anyone wants to grab that
Oh, all right.
bookmark. I mean, feel free to send the email. That might be. more bookmarked for some people. I put it in my folder. So
All right. So I just sent an email out to the Scott School students, but if you put it in the chat, that's awesome. So it should be easy to access either by the link in the chat or by the email I just sent out. I will by tomorrow evening, I will have this class from this evening posted on that in on that channel as well.
Okay. Aha.
All right, we're right at time. I'm going to give it about another couple of minutes. Well, I'm 6:02 here. The clock in my office is slow. I'm going to get it to about 6:05 and we'll get started. I have a good bit to cover this evening. This is probably, well, hard to say that's one of the last. I was working on later centuries today, and well, I'm usually at 50 and 60 slides. I was at 122, which means we're probably not going to get past anything more than that one century that night, that evening, but we're not there yet.
you got to control yourself. You can't include everything. You must summarize. Summarize.
I had that exact same thought as I'm going through there. It happened. I was covering the 19th century, and a lot happens. And I got finished and realized that I had barely touched on the American church at all, and I hadn't touched on slavery. And I'm like, well, I got to kind of cover that because you know, that affected the church, and there was really, there's a few things that happened that were notable. So I had to go by and I had to add another, I don't know, better part of 10 slides to go through all of that. And I had the exact same thought of I just can't cover everything.
As much as you might want to.
I mean, and even in the English church, there's just so much happening. 50 years, and you're like, I can't. I can
Yeah,
hardly
I
remember
know.
all the important players, let alone like what was the important theology.
All right, I think we're gonna get started. I don't see anybody else here. It's well, 6:03. Yeah, we're till 6:05, so I'll give it 2 more minutes. You never know, especially with the Filipinos. I feel bad for those guys. I don't know what is it, 6 a.m. out there or something like that on Saturday? I mean, that's
It's
like
isn't it 7? It's basically noon.
basically noon.
Yes, yes. 7 a.m. 7
7
a.m.
a.m. on a Saturday. I feel bad. I almost feel like like you're gonna like dislike me or something for making you get up at 7 a.m. If somebody got me up at 7 a.m. on Saturday, I would not be happy. So I feel bad for you guys.
It's okay, Father.
All right. So there are no questions about what we had last time. I don't know. Sometimes people ask me for things to follow up on, and sometimes I'm able to do it, and sometimes I'm not. Not because I don't want to, but because I get caught up in something. So anyway, no more questions. All right. I'm going to go ahead then and all right. Can you all see my slides there of the 6th century?
Yes, sir.
All right. Let's get started. Start with a quick prayer. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. Amen. Watch over us, O Lord, as we study the history of thy church and help us to appreciate and savor all the men and women, everything that went into it. Give us wisdom as we study thy history. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. Amen. All right. The 6th century of the 500s was a time of real change and shift for the church in Europe and such, really the world. I'm going to cover four. There's probably a bit more than that. East and West, the growing cultural divide, monastic expansion. There's a lot. You're going to hear a lot about monks from me, because I know about it. But second of all, it was one of the key tools that they used for the evangelization. Barbarian kings. We saw the fall of Rome last time, and a new kind of Europe is growing. The church is going to be very involved in that. And then trying to save the empire, I actually find which I find to be a very amusing chapter. East versus West. The eastern half of the Roman Empire was created differently than the western half was. It was conquered by Roman forces from areas that were already culturally rich, many much older than Rome, like the Greek world. It had traditions, prejudices, and need which were different from the West, like its proximity to Jerusalem, its possession of Antioch, both of which were older and claimed more dignity than Rome. The culture of the Byzantine world was very different from the Latin West, and only growing more so. You can see here the way that the Eastern celebrates their liturgy. You can see the elaboracy and this is inside of the iconostasis, which I'll go into in more in a second. With compared with the Western Church and how much more simple it is, and how many fewer people are actually involved. You can see with bishops the how elaborate the bishop's dress is in the East, with compared to a bishop in the Western Church. You can see monastics in the West and how they behaved compared with monastics, and these are a combination of the two from the East. You can see the difference on how they wear, what they wear, and things like that. Culturally, you can see a great deal of difference. Liturgy and worship. The Byzantine liturgy was elaborate and complex. The roles of deacon and priest were very different, and the deacon seemed to run that show. And what a show it was! The Byzantine liturgy was only sung and only celebrated when the community came together. It was a celebration, so no liturgy was offered during penitential seasons. There's no liturgy offered during Lent. A private priest could not offer liturgy by himself. This is a counselor. You can see the elaborate um, vestments and the elaborate layout of the Byzantine churches, the Eastern churches, how different it looks from the West. The mitre is kind of like a crown, mushrooming the hats, the various the with the veil on it for the monks. How much different it looks from the way that the um, Western Church does its vestments and liturgy. There's again a bishop. You can see him behind the iconostasis. You see the altar spread out with gold. The altar is square and bigger in overall circumference than that of Western churches. And you can see the gold and the icons and everything else on the walls. You see the iconostasis there, the priest, the book covered in gold with the icons there. You see the sash that the deacon wears, and you can see how how much more it's almost more complex the way that the Eastern liturgy is laid out. Here is an example of an Eastern liturgy. It turns out the guy in the red and gold right there is myself, is yours truly, when I spent some time with the Byzantines. And you can see how it's laid out. This is a much smaller church, obviously, how complicated and involved and how many moving parts there are to a Byzantine liturgy. The fans here, they bring in the bread and the wine, which are leavened bread and such. A Byzantine church is designed very differently from a Western church. The focus is up, not forward. So when you walk in, you are not looking at the altar, which is behind the iconostasis. People tend to wander during the service. The focus of an Eastern church is up. You are in, and I should have put a slide for this, but you are in the court of Almighty God. It is the royal court. Remember, this is Constantinople, all right, or the churches around it. So the emperor is there. So you are walking into the emperor of the universe. And as you walk in, the iconostasis is in one spot, but there are icons and there are places to burn candles, and you go around. But God is above you, watching down, and so when the liturgy begins, it does not begin in one place. You do not have an opening procession, with all the cross bearers and torch bearers that come out from within the iconostasis and begin. Blessed be the kingdom of the Father, Son, and the Holy Ghost. So it begins very differently. You can see here how it's laid out with the icons. You can see the naos, the center, the square part in the center, and then on the down here you can see behind your iconostasis where the clergy go. But you can see how it's very much there's no pews. There really, seriously, there's no place to sit down. You stand the entire service. So the Byzantine structure, the theology behind its worship, and the theology behind the temple, the Byzantine church, are very different from that of the West. The Christ Pantocrator is the focus of a Byzantine church. Christ is above you, looking down. The icons are called windows into heaven, and it is believed that Christ can see through that icon and can see what's going on and can see you. So, and you can see the walls. If you can see that they're not plain, it's gold. There's writing in the inside here. These are actually the seraphim. There's a huge devotion to the seraphim. You can see Mary. You can see the angels and this kind of stuff. Very, very rich and elaborate. Again, you're in the court of the emperor. The dignitaries are standing around the throne. Prayer in the Byzantine East is like a wave. It ebbs and flows. It can be repetitive and even redundant. Unlike the Catholic West, where prayer is to the point, rarely redundant, and each prayer has a message. You will hear that in the East. Lord have mercy, Christ have mercy, be this, oh Lord, do this. And you listen, and then they'll actually have different voices that are back and forth. I won't say competing, but they fill the air with prayer, unlike the West, which begins and ends a prayer with a purpose to it. All right, you can see here one more time is the iconostasis, behind which is the altar, and the clergy there going around and being involved in the liturgy. This is the Holy Virgin Cathedral of San Francisco. I've visited this many times. Really is something to behold. You look at the walls, you look at the icons, you look at how busy and complicated it is. It is the court of heaven, and you are seeing, in some ways, the history of the court of heaven, history of the saints, and the iconostasis with its doors and such. And you have, again, the icons even there. If you actually look, and this is not a very good photo, this area that I'm indicating over here is actually a body. He's not really incorrupt. He looks like but he's not, he's not decayed, but it's actually the body of St. John of San Francisco in that cathedral. And now for something completely different. To quote Monty Python, in order to complete this topic, I need to introduce someone, but I cannot without giving you some background on where he came from. So, Western monastic expansion. This began in the 400s, as we saw last time, but attraction to the monastic life as society deteriorated and the need for missionaries increased. Two institutions rose which answered the call: the cathedrals and the monasteries. The cathedrals were seats of bishops who had the main task of evangelizing unchristian people and educating Christian people. Those who sought the priesthood and a chance to evangelize and teach sought the cathedral. Monasteries for those who did not want to deal with unchristianized people or who sought a life of peace where they could work and study. Monasteries had a great attraction. What was most interesting is that many of the bishops chosen to become missionaries were not taken from the cathedrals. They were taken from monasteries. So the cathedrals and monasteries began to resemble each other. We saw this a little bit with St. Augustine. This was because monasteries had more stable education systems. Monks were not married, which secular clergy could be, so they were unencumbered by family, and they were trained living in a disciplined life, which turned out to be an excellent tool for evangelization. As Western monasticism grew, various influences directed the movement. From the East, the rule of St. Basil was popular, but it was Eastern and contained a lot of eremitical or solitary elements. The rule of St. Augustine remained popular. It was primarily for clergy. The rule of St. Augustine is actually not very long and not very in-depth, and it's a series of recommendations and counsels. The rule of St. Columba had some popularity, but it was Irish, and they're predominantly solitaries. The rule that was to win out was that of St. Benedict. But why? St. Benedict was Italian from a common family. He was attracted to monastic life and went and lived in Subiaco, or Italian for under the lake, sub and then laco, technically the L's become I's, under lake. He lived there for a few years when he was invited to become the abbot of a local monastery, whose abbot had just passed. He agreed, but left very quickly when the monks were unwilling to accept Benedict's discipline. In fact, they tried to poison him. He was recalled back when the monks were convinced to accept Benedict's rule. His rule is a synthesis of other rules and a paragon of moderation. This is the key thing to understand about St. Benedict's rule. It was not written in a vacuum. He had read all of the other rules and had chosen what he felt was the most prudent. His rule is more fleshed out, contains information about eating, about praying, about sleeping, about what to wear. It's very thorough, and it comes from having read the other rules. St. Benedict's rule organizes the monastic day into regular periods of communal and private prayer, sleep, spiritual reading, and manual labor. The motto of the rule was Ut in omnibus glorificetur Deus, that in all things God may be glorified. The level of detail, the recognition of specific faults common to monastic life, and the moderation it showed made ideal for Christian Europe seeking to find its footing. I made a mistake there. To combat the ills that had besought it, and to work toward converting those who still remain both inside and the empire, outside of the empire, to be unchristian. The rule of Saint Benedict provided a very stable framework. Monasticism was an exceptional tool for evangelization, not having to try and explain what Christianity was about. Non-Christian peoples being evangelized had only to visit a monastery to see the Christian life being lived. This was an amazing, important aspect. Was it when monks would come to an area and set up a monastery and begin living this, the pagans would come in and would see them singing the Psalms, seeing them in community, might even be invited to come in and join them a bit. And they could see this ordered life of silence and peace and respect and obedience. And they could see the Christian life lived out very, very obviously right in front of them. This is from the Rule of St. Benedict itself. It is clear there are four kinds of monks. The first is that of Cenobites, that is the monastic kind who serve under a rule and an abbot. The second kind is that of the anchorites, and that are hermits or eremites. And these are they who are not no longer have novice-like fervor, the life of conversion, but by daily discipline of the monastery have learned to fight against against the devil, sorry, and are thoroughly experienced in the solace that being one of many affords, and who, being well established for the lonely battle of the desert, beyond the fighting line of their brethren, are already brave apart from the consolation of companionship, and are competent to fight single-handed, God helping them against the vices of flesh and mind. The third kind of monks is that very disgraceful kind of the Cenobite, who have not been brought under discipline by any rule dictated by experience, so as to become as gold refined by the heat of the furnace, but who, soft as lead, while still by their works keeping faith with the world, are known by their tonsure to be lying to God. These are they who, by twos or threes, or indeed singly without a pastor, enclosed not in the Lord's but their own sheepfolds, take law for their own whim, since whatever they think and choose they call holy, whatever pleases them. The fourth kind of monk is that called gyrovags, who live all their lives going guests for 3 or 4 days at a time in different groups of cells to the various provinces, always wanderers and never settled. They are slave to their own pleasure and snares of gluttony, in every respect worse than the Cenobites. Concerning this most miserable manner of life of all of these, it is better to be silent than to speak. Leaving these out of our calculations, therefore, let us come to arranging by the Lord's help the most stable kind, the Cenobites. So there's actually a rule called the rule of the master, which if I remember, I'll post you if I can send a link to it. It really is kind of interesting, and you can see that he'd read it before. I don't necessarily recommend reading it entirely or for curiosity, because it's actually fairly graphic in its explanations of the errors of monks and things that they did. But it's interesting to see how Saint Benedict had read these various rules and had gathered together and put the best of them together into his rule. Saint Gregory the Great was a noble Roman, a senatorial family. He became a Benedictine and turned his ancestral house into a monastery and was later elected abbot. But before that, he was papal envoy to Constantinople. What he saw there affected him. In 579, Pope Pelagius II made Gregory a deacon and sent him as Apocrisiarius, a legate, to Constantinople. There, Gregory lobbied for aid against the Lombards, but remained ignorant of Greek. In 585 or 86, he returned to Rome and St. Andrews, resuming the office of deacon. Gregory found the court and church of Byzantium opulent and even decadent. He felt this was contrary to what the West should be. Upon his return, and once ordained bishop, he implemented changes to the liturgy and practice of the church to reflect his vision of a Western Christianity. Gregory was elected pope toward the end of the 6th century. When Gregory became pope, he actively worked to form Western Christianity away from Eastern opulence and toward a certain simplicity. Now back to our story of East versus West. The one key figure that stands out in the struggle for identity between East and West is that of St. Gregory the Great. Gregory grew up in Rome, was an abbot of a distinguished monastery, by the time went to Constantinople, and what Gregory saw there would change the Western Church forever. Byzantine Christianity and Constantinople were opulent and even decadent. Worship reflected that. And here we see an example. Here's again the cathedral from San Francisco, the Eastern, and here's a Western church. And you can see very quickly the difference. Western churches are simple. Our stone architecture, graceful lines, but lacks any of the over decoration of the East. Western churches, again, this is a bit later with the Gothic, so this is early Middle Ages, but you can still see the simplicity, clean lines, unadorned, no gold, very, very simple, harmonious and beautiful, yet very simple. The vestments, too, the vestments of the Western church were much simpler. They were not ordained in gold, they were not embroidered, they were not brocade, although later on you do in the brocade, we'll get to that. But for the most part, it was simple cloth, usually silk, but a little bit of ornament, but not extensive. You see again here the altar and the walls and such, very simple, not gold, not ornate, elegant but simple. The chapel, you have statues and you have them, but you can see how much different it is, the East versus the West. Here is another monastery. This is actually the monastery where I was for 4 years. I helped build it. And you can see here, this is the singing of the gospel. You can see the vestments can be beautiful, but how much less opulent the situation is. This is the chapel. In fact, if you look here on the left-hand side, the person kneeling is yours truly, is myself. When we're just getting started, and you can see here again the simplicity of Western churches versus the opulence of the East. Here's a Western church. This is actually the parish I served at. I'm the thurifer in this mass, so I'm not pictured here. But you can see the ceremonies can be elaborate, but they're by no means as opulent as the services of the East. Questions? All right, I almost put one in the middle there, but I wanted to get through that whole thing. Any questions about the East-West divide? Nope. All right, onward and upward. There was a new kind of leadership taking hold in Europe at this point in time, the barbarian kings. These were the rulers of the tribes who had come in the absence of Rome and had begun to establish kingdoms in the independent individual kingdoms for their peoples within the Roman Empire, not linked by a Roman imperial system any longer, not part of any kind of centralized government. These are individual kings forging individual kingdoms. Thus, a European ruler, a Roman ruler in the year 100 would have looked like the man on the left, versus now the rulers in the year 500 would look like this. Very different, very different culturally, very different militarily, and very different governmentally. The governments were run under independently and very differently, each one to itself. The same with the military. On the left-hand side, this is the military about the year 100, with the similar armors and similar shields and weapons. Where on the right, you can see here how it's really almost individual person has kitted themselves out as best they could to be able to fight. So again, very different armies. The changing political landscape provided both a challenge and an opportunity for the church. The settled Christianity of the Roman Empire was crumbling, but a new field for evangelization was being born. This also provided the church an opportunity to avoid some of the problems that were inherent in the faith of the first 5 centuries. However, they also encountered new challenges from the cultures they were evangelizing. As the new missionaries went out to the various tribes throughout Europe here, from the Franks to the Visigoths to the Ostrogoths to the Celts, each one had to navigate a new environment, a new king, a new kingdom, new customs, and it was a real challenge to be able to figure out what an individual king or individual tribe would take to have them listen to the gospel. Sometimes it was simply a matter of arguing with them and showing them the strength of the gospel over their paganism, and sometimes superstitions would stand in the way, or sometimes a holy man who would refuse to kneel, refuse to accept, would take the whole tribe with him, and the evangelist was left wondering what to do next. Visigothic Spain is a fascinating story of courage and determination. So, if you remember, the Visigoths were made Arians as they first came into the Roman Empire and settled in Spain, but they were Arians, and there was some persecution of Catholics. But the Catholics retained and struggled and remained patient, and finally, through a marriage, an Arian king to a Christian princess or a Catholic princess, Spain finally came over and became an Orthodox Christian kingdom. It's interesting here, and I didn't put the quote in there because it's not that important. It's one of the first evidences of racism I've ever seen. And I don't mean this directly, but there's actually a narrative of, I think it's actually a dream. I don't think it actually happened, although I don't know. Again, it was from a book that I have, and it says that these various people were coming in to meet the king of Spain, and one of them came in was a man from Ethiopia, and it said the man was an evil man and heinous, and his black soul reflecting in his black skin, which I thought was very odd. I guess they hadn't seen it before, but they presumed he was evil because his skin was dark. I'd never seen that before. Anyway, but Visigothic Spain was an amazing kingdom, very Christian, and again, the fighting against the Arians and forging it to be Orthodox and Catholic. Saint Augustine of Canterbury confronted Celtic Christianity in England. Roman Christianity was more organized and civilized. Celtic Christianity was more independent, but also wild and rather savage. Britain adopted Roman Christianity. She felt more aligned with Europe than the Celts. It was Patrick who would convert the Celts. Augustine of Canterbury again came in, and Celtic monasticism was not nearly as organized as Roman monasticism was. So when Augustine of Canterbury came in and brought Benedictine monasticism and Roman ceremony and such, there was far more organized than the Celts were, and many of them recognized that, and he was able to bring over the kingdom of England It didn't happen all at once, mind you, but it did happen. It began with the major kings accepting it and going from there. St. Patrick in Ireland. St. Patrick is unique among the missionary saints at the time that he basically single-handedly brought Christianity to Ireland. You could even say he brought the entirety of the island to Christianity by himself. He did it as a bishop with his episcopal entourage, singing psalms, him in full regalia, and demanded the Irish king to address him as an equal. What Patrick would do would walk around the island dressed fully as a bishop with his entourage with him, and they would sing the psalms in Latin as they walked along in this harmonious chant. And as he got up there and he would meet an Irish king, his deacons and people obeyed him, got everything set up for him as he spoke. And the Irish kings looked at this and said, "We don't have anything like this. Nobody obeys us like this." And they were very impressed by not only the beauty of his ceremony, but by the discipline of his court and the obedience of his servants. And they one by one realized that they wanted what he had, and he was able to convert Ireland. Celtic Christianity and monasticism. So the Celts were their own thing. They had received Christianity very early on, and they were a unique people, very clannish, as you're aware, unlikely to join, and with a very independent spirit. And Christianity looked very different as it went among the Celts. The Celts were a tough people, and their monks and nuns reflected that. Really more akin to St. Benedict's gyrovags than Cenobites, Celtic Christianity was based upon the spiritual voyage, and the monks were frequently travelers. Brendan the Navigator, the most famous example. Celtic spirituality is a voyage. You're the voyage toward God, the voyage from away from sin through baptism, and they saw almost like the Israelites going through the Red Sea and then the 40 days of the wilderness. This idea of wandering and being directed by God, and then everything that happens is God is behind it, and you can see God's will, and the entire thing is based around a voyage and the idea of really being staying in one place or being in a cell for any length of time really doesn't figure all that much into Celtic spirituality. Brendan the Navigator and the legendary voyage. Brendan is primarily known for his legendary journey to the Isle of the Blessed, as described in Navigatio Sancti Bredani Abbatis, or the Voyage of St. Brendan the Abbot of the ninth century. Many versions exist that narrate how he set out on the Atlantic Ocean with 16 monks, although other versions um, it- although other versions record 14 monks and 3 unbelievers who joined the last minute to search for the Garden of Eden. One of these companions is said to have been Malo. The voyage is dated at between 512 and 530, before his travel of the island of Great Britain. On his trip, Brendan is supposed to have seen St. Brendan's Island, a blessed island covered with vegetation, also to encounter a sea monster, an adventure he shared with his contemporary Columcille. The most commonly asserted adventures is his landing on an island which turned out to be a giant sea monster called Yasconius. It's actually, if you want to see, that's an example. It's a drawing of him landing on this thing, the sea monster. This is what Celtic monasteries look much more like than anything Benedictine, with huts scattered around a main church, usually made of stone. Much more like this than any kind of monastery you'll see from in Europe. They live mostly on their own, very, very sparse fare. They come together regularly to pray in the churches, but the monastic life was one of a voyage that you took by yourself or with a small group of people. Again, almost sounds more like St. Benedict would condemn it, but the Celtic monks were a tough lot and very independent and did not easily follow leaders. And when they did find a leader, they followed him very, very loyally. All right. Any questions on evangelization and monasticism throughout the 500s?
How long did the church maintain some uh, independence. I mean, even as Britain was Romanizing, wasn't there some bishops that remained, I mean, maybe not nominally Celtic, or was it all destroyed by the change of the Norman conquest?
No, absolutely. When the there's a synod whose name I've forgotten. I think it actually might be Whitby. I think I cover it later
Yeah,
on.
yeah.
There's a synod, and they have the Celts and the Romans together, and they argue about it. And there was a part of the Celtic bishops who refused to agree and just left and went off
Mm.
on their own and remained independent. They ended up dying off because they just weren't organized enough. So as they got old and died, they didn't necessarily have other people to replace them. So within 2 generations, for the most part, it's gone, primarily because they just weren't organized enough. They were very independent. But yes, absolutely. You had a noticeable percentage of the Celtic bishops who did not want to follow Rome. Um, I've read accounts, and I've never read them all that carefully because it's a lot of it is speculation, and that's something I don't necessarily especially care about. But that the there were a number of differences in the worship. There were differences in the number of different things that Rome had, and Rome wanted them to abandon all of theirs and pick up all the Celtic stuff. And some of the Celts were like, "Well, what if? Or how about this? Or how about that?" And Rome was like, "No, you just really need to leave off and become Roman." And so there was, you probably had, in fact, what you probably, in fact, I almost can think of examples, was some secretization. You have people adopting mostly Rome but hanging under this or that Celtic practice, and that probably happened quite a bit. So that after the Synod of Whitby, to go off, and this particular Celtic bishop or whatever doesn't want to adopt things, but sooner or later he goes and joins the Romans for this or the Romans for that, and after a while he may still do some Celtic things, but more and more it's going to become Roman. And again, within a generation or two, the majority of them are Roman, and so Celtic really is fringe.
Especially why powerful institutions are so important.
Any other questions? Going once, going twice.
Um, didn't the marriage of King Oslo of Northumbria play a part in that? I know it got the two churches on one calendar.
I believe so. I mean, I go into a little bit of that. I don't necessarily go that granular when it comes to dynasties, but I will go into a little bit of that in a little bit. Yes, women actually play, and I'm going to cover this in the not too distant future. Um, Played an enormous role of insisting that their husbands be baptized before they would marry them. And so they played an enormous role of converting a lot of the pagans, and again, even into Romanizing. The women played an enormous role, yes, not only in educating their children, but insisting that their husbands convert and things like that. So, yes, absolutely.
What I learned when I was over in Durham, right outside of Northumbria, uh, basically it was King Oslo, and he married a Roman Catholic. King Oslo was the king of Northumbria.
Hmm.
Saint Cuthbert considered the last Celtic saint, and it really had more to do with matrimony and the dates of Lent, which was a time of matrimonial, what do I,
Abstinence. Mhm.
abstaining or abstinence, and therefore, being that the Celts were on the old calendar and his wife was on the new calendar, therefore, his period of matrimonial abstinence was twice as long as it should
Let's
have been.
consider that did not please him.
And
That's
therefore,
amusing.
and therefore he went back, and it said that St. Cuthbert was not really in favor of that. He really liked the old ways, but he felt that it was his role to keep the church one church,
Uh-huh.
and he was kind of a King Oslo's spiritual advisor, so that it was through him that the Celtic Church came over onto the Roman Church calendar, and therefore, I mean, that was the beginning of the end. But
Interesting.
anyway,
That's
that's what
very
I was taught when I was over there.
that may very well be true. That's funny. That's very common. Too, and again, you'll see that they do that. The idea of the women, especially, of following the Roman law and the Roman insisting that they be more Roman or more closer to Europe, and again Christian in general, because some of these were still pagan. So absolutely. All right, any final? Off we go. Reclaiming the empire. So, as we saw last time, that the barbarian kings had flowed into what was once the Roman Empire. And you can see in this map here, the right-hand side, the old Greek world is all broken down into Roman administrative areas here, just like it had been under the Roman Empire. Whereas on this here, you have individual kingdoms broken down by whatever king was occupying the area here. And this did not please the empire, as it were. So you can see here again is a bit better of the kingdoms: the Ostrogoths, the Burgundians, the Franks, the Visigoths, the Basques, the Sueves, and the Vandals, when all the areas that used to be controlled by by the Roman Empire. Enter just the emperor Justinian. Justinian is Greek. He is Byzantine, lives in Constantinople, speaks Byzantine Greek, and he wants to take back and reestablish the empire. He wants to go and find those areas that were lost and make them Roman again. So he is going to go off and have a campaign to head over and reconquer the areas that were lost. You can see here the darker orange are the areas that were already under him at the beginning of his reign, and the lighter areas are areas that he conquered, going around the north of Africa and into Italy. Um, and you can see he makes some progress. But this is one of the most fascinating and kind of funny aspects of the history of the Roman Empire, was that when the man on the left, Justinian, who did not speak Latin, he spoke Greek, came around and showed up in Visigothic Spain or Frankish Gaul and met the man on the right who didn't speak Latin. He spoke German. It was their bishops who spoke Latin back and forth. And Justinian says, "I'm here to reconquer Rome." And the man on the right, who came in under Rome and thinks that he basically is a local governor or a local leader in the name of Rome, says, "Sure, I'm Roman. Let's go take Rome back." And so Justinian realizes that he really isn't Roman himself. He speaks Greek and is part of this later iteration of the Roman Empire, and he runs into this Germanic, Visigothic, or Gallic king who doesn't speak Latin either and really isn't all that Roman. That Rome was had changed, that it was no longer the Rome that it was, and he realizes that that it's going to be a Christian empire, not necessarily reconquering. He does reconquer some, but he also realizes that what it means to be Roman had changed. Any questions on that? That was a shorter chapter, so all right, off we go. All right, that is the end of the 500s here, so we've finished a little bit early on this one. We have the 600s. Or any questions before we take a break here? All right, let's do about maybe between 5 and 10 minutes here. We can take a bathroom break or whatever, and we'll start up again. All right. Are we about ready to get going? Everybody want a minute or two more?
Then we're good.
All right. The 600s. Um, we saw the last one that you have the real changes going on in the nature of the government and structure of Europe, and that a new kind of evangelization is taking place, and that we saw that the East and the West were getting farther and farther apart in their way that they practice the faith and things like that. We're now going to see the continuation of the evangelization of the North. That was again during when Rome was a power. The there were fewer evangelical efforts into the North, but now that they have the this is really the fertile ground, if you will. You also have the rise of the papacy. Popes getting stronger and taking on more responsibility, and finally we'll look at the birth of Islam. New dynasties are being formed, and the church was at the center of this process. As kings were crowned in the newly formed kingdoms of Europe, the bishops made sure that each new king knew from whence his power derived. Also, bishops used bishops, monks, and canons to make sure that ceremonies surrounding royalty were magnificent, for which reinforced the people's impression of royal power and reinforced the church's influence. The church oversaw important marriages and dynasties. Whenever marriages would come together, the church was involved. The church would marry them. Whenever kings were crowned, whenever any people coming of age, the church made sure that there was a ceremony there done by usually a bishop, which involved many clergy and a great deal of ceremony to make sure that the kings were kingship and kingdoms were reinforced by the emphasis given them by the church, and many of the vestments and many of the other things were created at this time were created specifically for that purpose, to reinforce the idea of a king being anointed by God, whose power is derived from God, and him working with the church to govern. Marriages were solemnized, and indigenous bishops were chosen and enthroned. The church made sure its influence was felt in all aspects of life. Every time they would go to new area, they would train up the local people, and at some point they would begin to ordain clergy, and finally to make bishops out of the people of that various area who spoke the language, knew the customs, and would be most qualified to continue on the task of evangelization and Christianization of these areas. And so you see the even some local customs starting up among these bishops and how they do things, which weren't necessarily taking the pagan or the various Germanic customs, but they were respecting him and giving him a nod to them. The language they used was Latin, but there oftentimes you would have elements in there that would come in which would reinforce in these people's minds that this was truly an authoritarian it was a real authority here. The authority was divine, that the bishop had power, like not unlike a king, to rule, to govern, to bless, and to curse. France. The Germanic tribe of the Franks had arrived in the Roman Empire in the late 300s. Clovis, their king, was baptized in 508 and inaugurated the Merovingian dynasty, named for Merovech, but no one's quite sure who that is. The name means mighty in battle and may very well have been a nickname for Clovis himself. Interesting, Clovis in later manuscripts was written with a large C and afterwards a smaller Lovis, which became Louis in later manuscripts. In fact, the name Louis comes from Clovis. Clovis is the first Germanic king to be baptized. Thus, France is called the eldest daughter of the church. By 600, the Merovingian dynasty, aided by the church, is working to convert all of what is now France. Clovis is the first king to be baptized and became a model for new European kingship, a Christian kingship. If the church did not baptize you and crown you, did you really have authority? The church really wanted people to understand and believe that God was making kings. It was and was giving his seal of approval, so to speak. There's actually, and I didn't include it because it's not English, but there is a legend of an ampule, which is like a little vial of oil that was used for anointing kings, couldn't be found when they were going to anoint Clovis king, and an angel brought a vessel from a vial from heaven of oil, and they still have the Saint Ampule, this holy vial in the I believe it's Notre Dame in Paris. No longer based upon pagan standards, but Christian monarchs with Christian morals. The king's job became to preserve Christianity in the land where he was king. His job was to preserve and protect the faith. Aided by the bishops, it was to rule, but it was also to rule in a Christian manner. The area controlled by the Frankish kings, as you can see here, that much of what is now Germany was controlled um, was controlled by the uh, the Frankish kings at this point in time, and is later taken on by the French. But you can see how large of an area was controlled by the Frankish kings at this point in time. A lot of this area was mostly under evangelization, but this was the area that the Frankish kings held on to. England. The island of England was evangelized early by the Celts, and Christianity was well established by the 4 and 500s, as we saw last time. The inhabitants would be Romanized at the end of the 500s by St. Augustine. Still, they practiced a Christianity that was heavily influenced by the Celts and remained dedicated to this form of Christianity. They tended to be a rather independent people. With the arrivals of Anglos and Saxons, a new chapter was begun. These Germanic peoples were pagan and rather warlike, which posed a challenge to the Christian church. You can see here in 4 and 500s, the area of what is now Denmark and upper Belgium and what do you call it up here? The Angles, the Jutes, and the Saxons from all this area right up around Denmark come flowing into Britain, where the Celts were, and begin setting up establishments. And you can see the Britons. So on the left one side, you can see where the areas where these people came from and came down and settled in England. And on the right, you can see the indigenous, the Celts, were pushed more and more to the west and finally went down and settled in Brittany and France and Upper Galicia, the top part of Spain. Here you can see the kingdoms begin to establish themselves: Northumbria, the Mercians, West Saxons or Wessex, East Saxons and Essex, and then Kent. You can see here, and the Britons in Strathclyde along the west here are going to be the old Celts. And finally, you see here um, East Anglia, Essex, Kent, Sussex, Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria, as the areas slowly but surely coalesce and gain around individual, even different language groups. They didn't all speak the same language. They spoke a version of Germanic, but there were notable differences about them. But you can see how these areas settle and what those names look like today, based on the original tribes settling in those areas. Here we have again, you can see the capitals and you can see um, the areas come, and you can see now how England almost began to look like it does today, early on, as early as the 600s. And you can see in Northumbria, Dara, Lindisfarne, the north here. And this north is where we're going to be focusing on a good bit here. But you can see how these areas are held on by these kingdoms and take on their personalities. Converting the Anglos and Saxons. Great effort was made to Christianize the Anglo-Saxon peoples. From Gregory the Great's mission to the Angles, many saints sprang up to continue the mission. English religious life. One of the key things about religious life in England was how domestic it was. People would get involved. People would come around and join in the churches very easily. It was something that the English people were very literate people, and so very quickly they began to pick up the Latin, pick up the languages. Also, Gregory the Great didn't necessarily, or Augustine did continue to use some of the Anglo-Saxon here and there. So it made it something that was not just the monks that would go there, but you would see the common people getting more and more involved, both the monks there, but also the women, female evangelists. In England, women played a key role in the evangelization of England. Queens insisted on their husbands and children being baptized. Daughters of kings defied their fathers and became nuns, setting up schools which educated a whole generation of Christian women. The island of England boasts almost more female saints than any of the other countries in Europe. Women were, again, the idea of not being insisting that a man be baptized before they married him. Um, the idea of, we Mr. Bryant was talking about how the women were able to very quickly to make sure that their husbands were Christians and practicing the way they wanted them to. Many of them also took Christianity very seriously against the advice of their fathers and sometimes even husbands, mostly fathers, became nuns and began the work of evangelizing England, making it more thoroughly Christian. Aethelrith was an East Anglian princess, a Fenland and Northumbrian queen and abbess of Ely. She's an Anglo-Saxon saint and known as Ethelreda or Audrey, especially in religious contexts. She was a daughter of Anna, the king of East Anglia, and her siblings were Wendreda and Seabrooks of Ely, both of whom eventually retired from secular life and founded abbeys. Ethelred made an early marriage around 652 to Tonberg, chief or prince of South Weir. It almost sounds like it's in Wales. I'm not quite sure where. She managed to persuade her husband to respect her vow of perpetual virginity that she had made prior to their marriage, and upon his death in 655 she retired to the island of Ely, and there she was received from Tombeck as a mourning gift. Aelfled of Whitby, the daughter of King of Northumbria, defied her father who wanted her to marry, became a nun in the monastery of Ethelred. She established monasteries of women all over northern England, attracted many aristocratic ladies to her convent. They in turn educated a whole generation of women in Christianity, which hastened to the island's conversion. That's key by England, was how quickly it became thoroughly Christian, while other areas took much longer because the women went in there and taught the young women, and again insisted that the men be Christian. Ethelbert of Kent. She was from Kent, southern England, and was wont to be espoused to King Edwin of Northumbria. She insisted that Edwin and the children be baptized. Their marriage triggered the initial phase of the conversion of the pagan North to Christianity. Ethelbert of Fermotier. Ethelbert was one of the daughters of King Anna of East Anglia, although she was probably illegitimate. Her sisters were with Berga and Saethryth, who was the abbess of Fermotier Abbey in Brie, Sexburg, and Ethelrith, who were abbesses of Ely. Ethelberth and Saethryth were sent to the nunnery of Fermotier in France for their education. While there, Saethryth became a nun and eventually succeeded Ethelbert as abbess. As abbess, Saethryth began to work on a church in honor of the 12 apostles, which was left unfinished at her death in 664. At her request, she was buried in the church. After 7 years, a decision was made to move her bones to the Saint of St. Stephen to be found. Her body was found to be uncorrupted. Hilda of Whitby, the saint of the early church in Britain. She's a founder of the first abbess of the monastery at Whitby, which was chosen as venue for the Synod of Whitby in 664, an important figure in the Christianization of Anglo-Saxon England. She was abbess in several convents and recognized for her wisdom and drew kings to her for her advice. Aelfled of Whitby was a daughter of King Osu of Northumbria and Enflad. She was abbess of Whitby Abbey, an abbey of nuns that were known for their skills in medicine. From the death of her kinswoman Hilda first jointly with her mother, then alone, Aelfled was particularly known for her skills in surgery and personal attention to patients, as was Hilda, who was known for personalized medical care. Something that's interesting about England, it was partly founded on account of this and has continued on with this both very Benedictine and also the women being involved, was English domestic spirituality. The effect of women so early on and the Benedictine experience meant that a particular school of spirituality grew up called domestic spirituality. It was contrary to the spiritual combat so popular in other schools, a speculative effective synthesis. This is the conviction that our spiritual experience should always be guided by what the church has taught in doctrine, and the doctrine should be lifted up in prayer and meditation. It is the insistence that prayer, worship, and life itself are grounded with and heart are wedded. We see this spiritual harmony in Anselm's treatise and also in Julian of Norwich's Revelations of Divine Love, where every distressing detail of the Passion is related to almost a treatise on the doctrine of the atonement. The unity of church militant, there is a deep family relationship between the most prominent church leaders and most humble parishioners. One of the and we'll cover this more when we get to the Reformation. But one of the goals of the Reformation in England was that the Archbishop of Canterbury and the least schoolgirl would pray together the same way in the same language. This idea of being one church was very important to English spirituality. The unique humanism and optimism. It's a biblical virtue of hope in the midst of the endless details of everyday life. It maintains cheerfulness despite setbacks because it knows that God loves his people and will bring them victory in the end. It is as Julian of Norwich, the 4th century saint, says, the all-conquering hope. All shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. The foundation of Christian life is the liturgy. This is the worship in which we participate on Sunday, the Eucharist, the divine office, morning and evening prayer, and the prayer book. These have come down to us from the early church and have been steeped in prayerful meditation and theological precision. They teach us how to pray. All these prayers and meditations are biblical, either by direct quotation or in indirect reflection. The Book of Common Prayer is used by both the Archbishop of Canterbury and schoolgirls, confirms that Anglicans have a deep-rooted distrust of hyperclericalism, and to that only clergy make up the real church. This was something that's much more medieval, and I'm covering in 600 because it goes across the idea of English spirituality was already showing up and existing at this time, but that the idea of it isn't just a matter of the prayer of the clergy that has to do that because you see this in the medieval times, but that the idea of the Christian people coming together to pray is how important that is. Any questions? I have more, but I wanted to pause and let you check in. Any questions on what I've covered so far? All right, going, and off we go. Bede. Bede is one of the most important figures of the English religious life and English religious history, as his book would tell us, and his monastery, where he would chronicle and watch much of what happened in England religiously in these early years. He was one of some of the best observations we have. He was a monk at Wearmouth, an Anglo-Saxon monastery in North England. Bede lived his whole life in that monastery, being given the house when he was young and remaining till his death. So he was given to the house. It was a donate. As a young man, he was given to the house and just stayed there. It is through Bede we get the best glimpses of England in the 600s from his book, The History of the English Church and People. Did I hear something? Sorry. Um, the picture we get is one of turmoil. The Anglo-Saxon people were distrustful of the Celts, finding them a dangerous and rough people. Bede is even rather prejudiced against them, finding fault in their tonsure, their shaved forehead and darkened eyes, creating a skull-like appearance. The it's actually kind of funny. Bede actually at one point refers to the idea that there was no Christianity in a time for a while in England there, which we know is wrong because there were Celts all over the place, but he almost doesn't consider them Christian because they're so different than what he's used to. I will this is a video which is only so good. I'll put that in the email when I send it. Anglo-Saxon monks were Romanized and lived in communities, Benedictine, and their tonsure was a circle or the crown of the head. He would be so bold to say that Christianity left the island before the Anglo-Saxon arrival, which is clearly false. You can see here, this is not the best picture in the world, but you can see the Celtic monks with the front of the head shaved and the back of the head were longer, unlike the crown that was so common with the Romans. So the even the way that they looked was remarkably different. St. Cuthbert. St. Cuthbert was another monk turned bishop, became the Bishop of Durham in the north, as Mr. Bryant was saying, was influential in the evangelization of England. St. Cuthbert was respected by everyone he ran into and was sought after by kings and by nobles and various who would come and would visit with Cuthbert. He was a very noble man and an excellent Christian and a great pastor. St. Boniface is the next phase of our evangelization of Europe. He was British and trained in a monastery and was sent to Germany to evangelize. You can see here the German holy card of St. Boniface heading off to go and to convert England or Germany, pardon me. Boniface famously chopped down the tree of Thor to prove that Thor would not strike him dead and built a church on that site. He went to Geismar, to Darnar's oak, called the Oak of Thor. This tree was a sacred site for pagan Saxon people where they would worship and make sacrifices of animals and sometimes of people. Barnabas took his axe, cut down the tree in front of a large group. This was a horrific religion which had sacrifice. A lot of the very northern ones did, and he came in and cut it down and used the wood, as legend goes, to build a church. It was a great deal of courage to do that Saint Boniface showed as he went among the German peoples. Any questions on that section on any of the evangelization of England or of Germany or of any of those areas? Right, off we go. The rise of the papacy. You're going to see at this period of time that the papacy is going to see that as the evangelization happens in these various areas, the fact that the papacy is stable and relatively well run becomes a bulwark for people to go back into Rome, to places people could come and meet in Rome and talk about problems and figure out answers. The papacy had been around pretty much since the beginning of the church. The chair of St. Peter, first in Antioch and then in Rome, was respected as a unique office. There was discussion, advocacy, and dissension about the role of the See of Rome, but a certain primum inter pares, or first among equals, was generally conceded to the Roman See. But it's still early, and the papacy had not yet become the center of the church, insisting that bishops, emperors, and kings should all obey the See of Rome. There were notable popes, like in the first century, like Pope Leo the Great, but the power of the papacy was still a thing being formulated. As Christianity spread and encountered new peoples, there became a useful way to end contentions by appealing to the papacy. Early councils did not appeal to the papacy, but as the Western Church became more coalesced, the papacy became a key element. Popes took the lead in the evangelical effort. This strengthened their position and gave the office a validity that it would exploit in the future. Gregory Great was possibly the greatest pope of the early medieval period. His manner and equanimity were a huge help in establishing the papacy as a moderate force and a center for evangelization. The papacy worked with kings to confirm and strengthening the burgeoning Christian kingdoms. The papacy arbitrated disputes between princes and bishops and princes and princes. Rome became a reliable court of appeals for early medieval Europe. As I said before, what you had was you had people who could come there and could argue it out in front of the papacy. It was a central place where you could go, neutral place in a sense, where you could go and argue about your problems. And the papacy was very wise in this regard because it took lawyers, it took theologians and brought them to Rome and held on to them and created courts of appeal and created air places where you could go and you could find, if you could bring your problems, you could bring your issues. Anything from territorial disputes to marriage disputes and dynastic disputes to questions of theology and regarding how to convert the various peoples of the north and such. All of these questions were brought down and argued in Rome. And Rome wasn't necessarily the heavy hand that it was in previous eras, although decisions were made. It really was a place where people, if you could argue with the various theologians and various lawyers and various people in Rome, and the papacy would issue its response, and these responses were often very, very respected. The papal court, the cardinals and archdeacons, made it their business to reply to inquiries, resolve conflicts with an efficiency that allowed the papacy to become a tribunal for religious questions. This gave it increased validity to the office, and while not all accepted the Pope as a final authority, many holy educated men who were elected during this period helped strengthen the papacy as an institution. They were very careful at this time to make sure the men who were elected Pope were truly qualified, very educated, and very good leaders and good pastors, bishops who had a lot of experience, so that you had some of this really some again the great very very educated, very moderate and good Christian men who were around the Pope. And the popes who came at this period were often very very moderate men and very capable, and they took into account any of the questions that were brought to them, and with a great deal of fairness and moderation. Really in some ways was one of the higher points of the papacy in the history of the church. Any questions about that?
Are the popes coming from? So you said at one point you said the bishops would often come from the monastery, and then
Right.
presumably those bishops then I don't know when the classic cardinal was made, but then whoever is becoming pope is also kind of from a monastic
Right.
lineage.
So that's a good question. Cardinal, I don't know if you know the history of that. So a cardinal, there are numerals, ordinals, and cardinals, and they refer to numbers. Numerals are one, two, three, four, five. Uh, Ordinals are first, second, third, and fourth, and cardinals are primary, secondary, and tertiary. So the cardinal churches in Rome were by rank and by order of importance. And so if a bishop was in Rome, he would be given one of the cardinal churches of Rome, and I don't know how many there are. Um, and these actually had rank. If you ever look into a Anglican missal or Roman missal, you'll see that certain feast days take place at certain churches: St. Mary Major's, St. Peter's, St. Paul outside the walls, and all. These churches were ranked, and these were the cardinal churches of Rome. And so cardinals initially were the bishops who were stationed at, actually, they were probably called um, anyway, they like deacon cardinal, but they usually were bishops. Anyway, they were stationed at these churches, and they became the Pope's advisors. They helped the Pope run the church in the Vatican from these cardinal churches, and then later on, they became you would choose one of these cardinals for the next Pope. Um, at some point, and I don't honestly know when, I could look that up, when they began having cardinal churches outside of Rome, or cardinals. You did have cardinals who were not Roman, and if I'm not mistaken, you did have popes who were not Italian. You've had popes who were Germans, you had popes who were French, and things, popes who were Spanish. You did have popes who were not Italians. So they really did choose. It wasn't like later on where you kind of assumed the Pope would be Italian, but especially during like the late medieval and Renaissance. But at this point in time, I don't believe you do. And I didn't look at it initially, but if you look at where the popes came from, I believe they came from. I mean, they were still probably. I don't know that you had very many. Although I think if you actually did have an English pope, and I think he's from around this time, but they were even whether they were German or English or wherever they were, they'd come to Rome and they were very learned and they were working in Rome and they would be into becoming pope. But people came from all over the world. What you'd often have was you'd have when they were struggling to build a monastery or struggling to build a cathedral or what have you, is they would take some of the young men and send them to Rome for a couple of years to learn and be trained in Rome, and they would come back and be much better and know all the chants, know all the ceremonies and everything, and it would make it much easier to build to Christianize the area, to build churches where people knew what they were doing, and you weren't trying to teach them. You know, they would go and they would watch other people do it, and you weren't trying to do all the work. So that's also where Rome fit in. But the you had the men from all over the world would come down and go to Rome and work there, and and then one of them would be chosen to be pope. And as I say, the cardinals has to do with these churches were ranked, and it was an honor to be installed in one of these cardinal churches, and some authority came with it. Any more questions? Off we go. The rise of Islam. Muhammad was born in 570. He was born in Mecca. His father, a tribal leader, died not long after his birth, and his mother died when he was about 6, leaving him an orphan raised by his grandmother. He was a somewhat solitary boy who enjoyed spending quiet time at Naba al-Nur. One day he claimed the angel Gabriel appeared to him and gave him a revelation which he copied down as Quran or dictation. Qumran and Quran are the same words. The dictation did not end with that one night, but continued for many years. Sometimes Mohammed would hear the voice in different places and would write on whatever he had handy, including the hide of what animal he was working with. Thus, the surahs, or chapters of the Quran, are called by the names of whatever he wrote on. Here is the cave where Muhammad first received his revelation. He calls Gabriel, shows up and speaks to him and tells him of the idea of this God whose name is Allah, which basically means God in Arabic. Um, I've never read the Quran thoroughly. I've studied it at 2 or 3 different occasions and heard people talk about it. From what I remember hearing, the very first night when he receives it, there isn't anything especially heretical about it. It may have been an angel that appeared to him. I don't know. As the revelations continue, they get increasingly heterodox. But as I recall, the first one, you read it and you're like, yeah, maybe that might be an angel. I don't really know. But as it goes on, it becomes increasingly heterodox. It was all written down in the Quran, which is this book, and so it is all based around the book. And the only official versions of the Quran are written in Arabic. Any translation is suspect. If you want to learn the Quran, you must read it in Arabic. It's all founded around this one book. The Arabic is classical Arabic, and the text and even the way it's written still nowadays is old Arabic. They don't use modern Arabic when they when they do the Quran. Um, everything is taken down and put into these surahs, into these chapters, and it actually reads in somewhat of a repetitive style when you read it in there. Mohammed began to preach his doctrine, which was very simple, really only a variation on the Jewish faith. Although the Christian time claimed it was a Christian heresy, there really is very little Christian about it. There are 5 pillars to Islam and a series of cultural and social duties. The structure of Islam appealed to the desert people of Arabia. Also, its message of jihad, or struggle, holy war, gave Arabian princes and warlords a cause to conquer in the name of this new religion. Islam took over the Arabian Peninsula very quickly and spread like a wildfire in North Africa and the Middle East. before I go into the five pillars, I don't know that I covered this later, but one of the things about Islam is that it is not evangelical in the way that Christianity is, where they want you to hear the good news. And it's not um, enclave like the Jews who live among their own people and don't really want anybody to come in. Islam dominated. It came in to an area you either converted or you died. It was a very invasive kind of religion. Fitted very the desert mentality and desert people. And so it would come in there and they would tell you need to become a Muslim, and either you converted or you died. So it spread very quickly, mostly through violence and intimidation. The five pillars of Islam is Shahada is faith, Salah is prayer, Sawam, I don't speak Arabic especially well, is fasting, Zakat almsgiving, and the Hajj is the pilgrimage. The number of times being prayed during the day is established in the Quran. Faith, I believe, other than the fact that there's just one God, is not very deep. Fasting is interesting in that the fast period of fast is there's a Lent period whose name I don't recall. And you're not able to eat while the sun shines. So you wait, you don't eat all day long, then you eat at night, which means people are useless during the day. All the area, nothing gets done during the day because you can't eat anything and you do it at night. So the almsgiving, and obviously the pilgrimage is the Hajj, and I'm sure you've heard of that. The One of the things about Islam was the speed at which it took over the areas that it was born into. Born in Arabia, it took over Arabia very quickly. It was its structure and its weight, its attitude fit very, very well with these tribal people, these nomadic peoples, and these desert peoples. And it united them all under a very simple theology. The morals and cultural structure were very desert, and it gave them a reason to go off and to conquer. So you see here how very quickly Islam takes over and spreads over these various areas, taking all over the west coast of Arabia, Medina and Mecca. All right, going across, crossing over to the eastern side of it, and then up into what is the Byzantine Empire and the area of the I'm not sure who's in the pink right there. It's the whatever Eastern people are called right there, but it spreads very very quickly into these areas. This was a new kind of army. They moved very, very fast. They were not heavily armored, and they felt and they had God on their side, so they would charge through and take over various areas and invade them and force people to submit to Islam. Um, it actually, oddly enough, was able to unite somewhat disparate peoples. There was still a lot of competition and a lot of dynastic struggle in Sunni and Shia, which I'm not going to go into because I don't. It really isn't. So I don't think I do. Which really doesn't. For us, it doesn't really matter. This was not evangelization we've been discussing. With Islam, either you converted or you died. Muslim armies swept not only through North Africa, but swallowed up the Byzantine Empire in one generation. Again, the desert dwellers and their fleet horses went after the Byzantine soldiers in their armor and were far faster and were able to chase them down. They weren't ready for it. One of the things about Islam is that no one saw it coming. All of a sudden, in one generation, out comes this furious force, invading force of these people from Arabia and the surrounding areas, and with this on this mission to conquer everything in the name of Islam, and no one saw it coming. There really was no warning, which is why they were so effective. You can see the Muslim conquests here within really 100 years. The first conquest of the Arabian Peninsula, the second conquest of the eastern part of the Byzantine Empire and into the area of Syria or what have you over there, what's now called the Levant, and the final expansion of North Africa into Spain, really very, very quickly. So there's a little over 100 years in that entire area, vast empire, almost bigger than what Rome had, is conquered by the early Muslim conquests. Both their fervor, the fear that they instilled in those that they were coming, and their ability to go in there and take over an area was really quite astounding. The two different, very different kind of armies. As I said, the armies of Europe right now are run by various barbarian kings. They equip themselves as best as they're able, usually with some sort of mail armor, shields, and such. The individual kings and kingdoms are not are even skirmishing with each other and are not necessarily cohesive within the individual kingdoms. The kingdom of the Visigoths is not necessarily cohesive in itself. The kingdom of the Franks is still not necessarily cohesive within itself. And the kingdom of Italy and these areas are still they are not a unified army with unified battle techniques and unified armor. Where when Islam comes in, it's fighting with a much more unified way of fighting here. It's much more it's desert, it's lightweight, and it's quick. And Europe was completely taken by surprise with the arrival of this army. Any questions about the rise of Islam?
There, there's a book called I think it's like The Great Heresies by Hilaire Belloc, who is a I
Yes.
think post World War II contemporary. He writes about Islam being a Christian heresy, and I mean I read through his argument. It it was hard. It was hard for me to see his parallel there.
It's so what what they have, and they've covered this in several different people, and I've had this argument with teachers before, is that anybody of the age in the 600s and 700s when this came out universally refers to it as a Christian heresy. But their perspective is the Jewish covenant is gone, and that Christianity is the covenant now, and so any heresy has to be a Christian heresy. And I think that's a little bit simplistic in its perspective. Um, I think what they saw was that the the Jewish faith was there is a simplicity to Islam that anybody who writes a commentary usually starts by saying how surprisingly simple it is. It's simple almost to the point of being stupid, quite honestly. There's a God, there's one God in heaven, and as long as you do these things, you're in good with him. There's no baptism. There's no even salvation is like what is it? The virgins in whatever the name of Islamic heaven is. I can't think right now. Um, it's much more cultural. It's much more about cultural control and doing the right thing culturally. Again, the Sharia law, I don't actually know when that came around, if it was back with Muhammad or not. But there's actually a German king whose name I don't recall, and his comment was Mohammed war nicht fromm. Muhammad was not devout. He was he saw that he received this thing and he saw it as an opportunity to gain power. And as the various Arabian princes took it also, they saw it as a way of gaining power, keeping power. So it really was much more cultural than theological and much more colonizing and invading than it was about civilizing. Later on, you're going to see, especially in Baghdad and Iran and those areas, you're going to in Syria and even in North Africa to a point, you're going to see Islam architecture and literacy and that kind of thing are going to thrive because of the fact that you have to read the Quran. The same thing actually happens in England later on. But you're going to see this that when they come in there, you're going to see that there is a that bringing that in is going to this kind of cultural cohesion that Islam brings, where you can take in Islam a book written in Islam in Spain and take it all the way over to Iran, and it can be read, and you have this the idea that this cultural cohesion is extraordinarily effective. But it's not a theological thing. It's turns out it's medicine and it's things like that. It's mathematics. It's business. It really isn't theology. So Islam is much more of a cultural thing, and the cultural cohesion. I'll go into that more next century on how what Islam is able to do because of this cultural cohesion is its real strength, and the idea that they had permit these warlords, these chieftains had permission to go in and conquer these people in the name of Allah was almost a pretext, if you will. Any further questions? I don't know how much more I have here. Yes, that's the end of that. We on the spread of Islam with the birth of the Christendom. All right. We can finish a little bit earlier this evening, but I don't think that's anybody's going to necessarily mind that. Any further questions on this one here? Believe me, there'll be evenings when we're going to have a hard time finishing on time. Any final questions on the 5 or 600s?
Do you think we could do a at some point kind of a more global recap? Each of these lectures have kind of like they are an overview. Um, well, actually, honestly, I should just make an outline myself. But I should do.
I can so I can do I can you want to do a let me think about that. Are
You
you
know, like
saying
there's like a greatest hits. I need to just go through. You're almost there. Like I mean, you're going fast enough. You're almost there, right? But like Council of Nicaea, things like that. There's going to be some big church moments, and because we're covering, I guess eventually maybe we'll focus on England, but right now the whole world, a lot happens.
Yeah, we are, and you're right. We do focus more on England as I go a bit forward. I focused a bit this evening on the evangelization of it, but obviously England was attached to the whole church, so you have to be aware of that. Um, I could certainly do. Let me look at that. Let me think about how be doing that kind of a greatest hits. What I'll do is I will when I send the email out with the link again for the website. Hopefully it gets updated to the website, but I will send this link out once I upload it to YouTube. Although you'll be able to see it at the YouTube channel. Feel free to reply with any areas that you feel you'd like to more information about, or I can look into putting together. Again, this is not an in-depth study of church history. This is designed to help you basically pass the diaconal exams, and I'm going over and I'm covering the major trends of the various areas. I remember when I first took church history or history in general, European history, I was very frustrated how fast we'd go over some of the trends, the Renaissance or the Romantic period and all this, and they would touch on these writers and touch on these things, but they wouldn't go very deep at all. And I'm unfortunately have to do some of the same. I want you to be aware that if someone says to you, "Oh, it's the period of the Anglo-Saxons where they came in and then they had the evangelization," oh yeah, okay, I've heard of Cuthbert, I've heard of his various people. The idea being is you've heard of it. You're familiar with the people involved, and if someone's speaking about it, you can speak intelligently about it. You're not mastering any of these areas right now. We're simply going into them so that you're familiar with them, that you know what they are, and can speak about them, and again, have heard of them and are familiar with them. And I can go into more depth in some of this maybe toward the end of the class. I don't know. I have got to figure out because we're doing 2 weeks at a time right now, but very soon that will not be the case. Um, and we're going to have to figure out how many weeks and how we do this. Because I wouldn't mind going back and either doing a recap or again areas that you'd like to know more about. I'll be happy to to do a little bit of a deeper dive on. So I will say again, by it's not going to be tonight, but it'll be tomorrow. As soon as I'm able to get around to it, I will upload the this video to the YouTube channel, um, and take a look at it. And again, if there's anything that come across you're like, I didn't get that, or I wouldn't mind more. And again, you'll see the slides, and I see if I can trying to find some way I can download the slides and share them, so you don't have to watch the whole video again. You can just look at the slides. If there's anything you'd like to know more about, or have me send you more information about, I'll be happy to do so. I'll give you a little bit of behind the, a little bit of the a little bit of Wizard of Oz behind the curtain here is that a lot of I'm going through a lot of Wikipedia for just quick facts about things. I'm really not doing a deep dive into this kind of stuff. I also don't have any. I haven't assigned any books on this right now. I can look into doing some. I look into some readings in a bit here, but right now I'm just trying to give an overview. But again, anything you're interested in more, to knowing more about, I will certainly look in. I can send you either an additional reading or additional information. All right, gentlemen, I'm going to let you go a little bit early this evening. Any final questions, thoughts, comments, or bad jokes? All right then. I will let you go. I will see you again. We'll see you next Friday at 6 o'clock, and we will go into the 700s. And you will you'll you will enjoy it when we get there.
Good night, Father.
All right, good
Nice
night.
one.